The dust kicked up by a dozen horses settled slowly over the ramshackle town of Willow Creek, Arizona Territory, in the summer of 1887. What had once been a thriving railroad stop was now little more than a collection of sun-bleached buildings clinging to life in the unforgiving desert. The heat shimmered off the wooden sidewalks, and the only sounds were the distant lowing of cattle and the creak of weathered signs swaying in the hot wind. Thomas McKenna stood in the shade of Sully's saloon, his calloused hands gripping those of his two small daughters. 7-year-old Mary looked up at her father with eyes that had seen too much sorrow for her tender years, while 5-year-old Emma pressed close to her sister's side, her tiny thumb planted firmly in her mouth. The girls wore faded dresses that had once been white, but now bore the stains of poverty and desperation. Their bare feet were dirty from the dusty streets, their only shoes having fallen apart weeks ago. Thomas himself was a shadow of the man he had once been. His clothes hung loose on his gaunt frame, and his beard was unkempt. Dark circles ringed his bloodshot eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he held his daughters close. He had been a proud man once, a successful rancher with 200 head of cattle and a homestead that was the envy of his neighbors. But drought, disease, and death had stripped away everything he held dear. A small crowd had gathered outside the saloon, drawn by word that spread quickly through small towns. Men in worn hats and dusty boots formed a loose semicircle around Thomas, their faces showing various degrees of curiosity, pity, and calculation. Some were drifters passing through, others were local ranchers and businessmen. All had heard the unthinkable proposition that desperation had driven Thomas McKenna to make. "Please, gentlemen," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper, thick with shame and desperation. "They're good girls, both of them. Mary here can already help with cooking and cleaning, and little Emma, she's sweet as an angel. $10 for both of them. That's all I'm asking. $10, and they'll be yours." The words felt like broken glass in his throat. 3 months ago, he would have killed any man who dared suggest such a thing. But 3 months ago, his beloved wife Sarah had still been alive. 3 months ago, he hadn't watched his daughters grow thinner each day while he stood powerless to feed them. Among the gathered men stood Jake Morrison, a cowboy who had ridden into town that morning with a small herd bound for Phoenix. Jake was 32 years old, his face weathered by years under the desert sun, his hands gentle but strong from a lifetime of working with horses and cattle. Unlike the other men who looked at the children with various emotions ranging from disgust to dark interest, Jake felt something twist painfully in his chest. Jake knew the hollow ache of abandonment all too well. He had been orphaned at 12 when Comanche raiders destroyed his family's ranch in East Texas, leaving him alone in a world that showed little mercy to the weak. He had survived by his wits and the kindness of strangers, eventually making his way west to build a life for himself. As he watched Thomas McKenna's shoulders shake with suppressed sobs, Jake saw himself as that terrified boy, desperate and alone. The crowd murmured among themselves, some men shaking their heads in disgust, others seeming to consider the offer with calculating eyes. One grizzled prospector stepped forward, his beard stained with tobacco juice. "What's wrong with he asked suspiciously. "Why you sellin' your own blood?" Thomas's face crumpled. "Nothing's wrong with them. They're perfect, beautiful girls. It's me that's the problem. I can't feed them. I can't provide for them. I thought maybe someone with means could give them a better life than I ever could." "I'll take them," Jake said quietly, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd like a knife through silk. Every head turned toward him, and Thomas looked up with a mixture of hope and terror in his eyes. You have the $10, mister." Jake reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a leather pouch. The crowd watched with growing interest as he poured the entire contents into his palm. $23.50 glinted in the harsh sunlight, representing everything he had earned from his last cattle drive. "I've got more than that," Jake said, his voice steady and calm. "But I'm not buying your daughters, McKenna. I'm hiring you." The crowd began to disperse, disappointed by the lack of spectacle they had hoped to witness. But Thomas remained frozen in place, his mind struggling to process what the cowboy had just said. "Hiring me? I don't understand, sir." Jake knelt down so he was at eye level with Mary and Emma. The older girl stared back at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity, while Emma continued to hide behind her sister's shoulder, her wide blue eyes peeking out at him. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked Mary gently, his voice warm and patient. "Mary McKenna," She replied in a whisper so soft it was almost lost in the desert wind. "That's a beautiful name, Mary. My name is Jake Morrison. I'm a cowboy and I work with horses and cattle on a ranch north of here. Do you like horses?" The girl nodded slowly, and Jake caught a flicker of something. It might have been excitement in her tired eyes. It was the first spark of life he had seen in her young face. Jake stood and faced Thomas again, noting how the man seemed to be holding his breath. "I've got a ranch about 50 miles north of here," Jake said. "It's not much, but it's got good water and decent grazing. The house is solid, and there's plenty of room. I need help working the spread, and you need a job. Bring your girls and come work for me. I'll pay you fair wages, provide food and shelter for all of you, and your daughters can grow up safe and loved." Thomas stared at Jake as if he were seeing a mirage in the desert heat. His legs felt weak, and he had to lean against the saloon wall for support. "You do that for complete strangers." "We're all strangers until we're not," Jake replied simply. "What do you say?" "McKenna. Want to be a ranch hand. Want to give your girls a real home." The journey to Jake's ranch took 3 days of traveling in Jake's wagon. Their meager possessions loaded in the back along with supplies Jake had purchased in town. During those 3 days on the dusty trail, Jake learned the full story of Thomas McKenna's fall from grace, and it was a tale that could have broken a weaker man's spirit entirely. Thomas had once been one of the most successful ranchers in his part of Texas. He had owned 200 head of prime beef cattle, a prosperous homestead with good water rights, and the respect of his community. He had been active in the local church, served on the town council, and was deeply, completely in love with his wife Sarah, whom he had married when she was barely 18 and he was 22. The trouble had started 2 years ago with the beginning of a drought that seemed to have no end. Month after month passed with no rain, and Thomas watched his grass turn brown and his water sources dry up one by one. He sold half his cattle just to buy feed for the rest, but it wasn't enough. A harsh winter followed the drought, killing most of his remaining livestock. The few cattle that survived were too weak to bring a good price at market. Then came Sarah's illness. It started as a simple cough that wouldn't go away, but it quickly developed into something much more serious. The doctor in the nearest town was expensive, and the medicines he prescribed cost more than Thomas could afford. He sold his remaining cattle, then his farm equipment, then anything else of value he could find. But it wasn't enough to save his beloved wife. I held her hand when she died. Thomas confessed on the second night as they sat around their small campfire under a canopy of brilliant stars. The girls were asleep in the wagon, wrapped in Jake's own bedroll. "She made me promise to take care of our babies, to keep them safe no matter what. But I failed her, Mr. Morrison, I failed them all." Jake poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks dancing up into the night sky. "Desperate times make us all consider things we never imagined we'd do," he said quietly. "The measure of a man isn't whether he stumbles when the ground gives way beneath his feet. It's whether he finds the strength to get back up and keep walking." Mary had been listening from the wagon, though she pretended to sleep. At 7 years old, she understood far more about their desperate situation than any child should have to. She had watched her mother grow weaker and weaker, had seen her father sell everything they owned piece by piece. She had felt the gnawing ache of hunger in her belly, and had tried to comfort little Emma when she cried from the pain of it. But there was something different about this cowboy, who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't dared to pray. When Jake Morrison looked at her and Emma, Mary didn't see the pity she had grown accustomed to, or the calculating look of men who saw children as burdens or commodities. Instead, she saw genuine kindness, and something else she couldn't quite name, but that made her feel safer than she had in months. Jake's ranch, when they finally reached it on the 3rd day, was modest but well-maintained and clearly built by someone who took pride in his work. The main house was a sturdy adobe structure with a red tile roof and a wide covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides. There was a solid barn, several corrals made of good timber, and various outbuildings scattered around a central yard that was shaded by ancient oak trees. A creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, its banks lined with cottonwood and willow trees that provided blessed relief from the desert sun. The sound of running water was like music after the dry wasteland they had traveled through, and Emma clapped her hands in delight when she saw it. "It's not fancy," Jake said as he helped the girls down from the wagon, noting how they looked around with wide, wondering eyes. "But it's home, and now it's your home too." Emma spoke for the first time since they had left Willow Creek, her small voice filled with awe. "It's the prettiest place I ever saw," she whispered, looking at the wildflowers that grew along the creek bank. Jake felt something warm expand in his chest at her words. "You think so, little one? Well then, why don't you and Mary go pick some of those flowers for our kitchen table while your papa and I get your things settled in the house?" As the girls ran toward the creek, their laughter floating back on the warm afternoon air, Thomas felt tears threaten again. It had been so long since he had heard his daughter's laugh that he had almost forgotten how sweet the sound was. "Mr. Morrison," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't know how I'll ever thank you for this kindness. Call me Jake, and you can thank me by being the best ranch hand I've ever hired." Jake replied with a smile, "No, let's get you folks settled in. There's a lot of work to be done, but there's also a lot of living to catch up on." The first few weeks at the ranch were a period of adjustment for everyone involved. Thomas threw himself into the work with the desperate gratitude of a man who had been given an unexpected second chance at life. He rose before dawn each morning to tend the horses, mend fences, and learn the countless tasks that kept a working ranch functioning. His body, weakened by months of poor nutrition and the stress of his losses, ached constantly, but he pushed through the pain with grim determination. Jake proved to be a patient teacher, showing Thomas the skills he would need to be truly useful on a cattle ranch. He taught him how to read the signs of illness in livestock, how to repair tack and equipment, how to judge the quality of grass and water. Most importantly, he treated Thomas not as a charity case to be pitied, but as a partner whose contributions mattered. But it was with Mary and Emma that Jake's true nature revealed itself most clearly. In the evenings, after the day's work was done and supper had been cleared away, he would sit with the girls on the front porch, teaching them to whittle small figures from pieces of cottonwood, or telling them stories about his adventures on the cattle trails of Texas and New Mexico. Mary proved to be a remarkably quick learner, with a natural affinity for animals that impressed even Jake. She would follow him around the corrals, watching intently as he worked with the horses, absorbing every detail of how he approached the animals, how he read their moods and body language. Jake began teaching her the basics of horsemanship, how to approach a horse safely, how to gain its trust, how to tell when an animal was frightened or sick. Emma, still so young and fragile, was content at first to simply collect wildflowers and chase butterflies around the yard. But she too was drawn to Jake's quiet strength and gentle manner. During their evening story sessions, she would curl up against his side without fear, something she hadn't done with anyone since her mother's death. One evening, about a month after their arrival at the ranch, Mary approached Jake as he sat on the porch repairing a bridle. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, and the air was finally beginning to cool after another scorching day. "Mr. Jake," she said softly, her small hands clasped behind her back, "are you going to make Papa go away?" Jake set down his leather work and looked at the serious little girl with surprise. "Why would you ask that, Mary? Why would you think I'd send your Papa away?" "Because Papa says we're borrowing your kindness," she replied, her voice barely audible. "He says we can't stay forever, because we don't really belong anywhere anymore. He says people get tired of helping after a while." The words hit Jake like a physical blow to the chest. He realized that Thomas, despite his obvious gratitude and hard work, still carried the crushing shame of that desperate day in Willow Creek. The man still saw himself as temporary, as a charity case who would eventually wear out his welcome and be forced to move on once again. "Mary," Jake said carefully, choosing his words with great care, "do you know what the word family really means?" The girl nodded solemnly. "It means people who love each other and take care of each other no matter what." "That's exactly right. And sometimes, sweetheart, family isn't just the people you're born to. Sometimes family is the people who choose to love you and care for you. Do you understand what I'm trying to tell you?" Mary's eyes grew wide as the meaning of his words began to sink in. You mean we could be your real family? Forever? If you want to be. If your Papa wants to be. This ranch has been my home for 8 years, but it's never felt complete until you and Emma and your father came here. You've made it feel like a real home for the first time." That night, long after the girls had been tucked into their beds, Jake found Thomas sitting by the creek, staring up at the star-filled sky. The man looked older than his 38 years, worn down by grief and hardship and the constant weight of responsibility. "We need to talk." "Thomas," Jake said, settling down beside him on the grassy bank. Thomas tensed immediately. "If this is about my work, I know I'm still learning the ropes. But I promise you I'm trying my best." "It's not about your work," Jake interrupted gently. "You're one of the hardest workers I've ever seen, and you learn fast. This is about something else entirely, something more important than ranch work." Thomas waited, every muscle in his body taut with anxiety about what might be coming. "I want to make you my partner," Jake said simply, his words dropping into the night air like stones into still water. Thomas stared at him in shock, his mouth opening and closing without sound for several long moments. "A partner." He finally managed to croak. "Jake, I don't have anything to bring to a partnership. No money, no cattle, no equipment, nothing. You're wrong about that," Jake said firmly. "You have 2 daughters who have brought more joy and life to this place in 1 month than I've felt in 8 years of living here alone. You have a good heart, willing hands, and the kind of character that can't be bought with money. You have loyalty and integrity, and the determination to do whatever it takes to protect the people you love. That's worth more than cattle or cash. Thomas, I still don't understand what you're asking of me." Jake picked up a handful of dirt from the creek bank and let it run through his fingers, watching it scatter in the moonlight. "This ranch has been good to me, and I've built something solid here. But it's been lonely, Thomas. Lonelier than I wanted to admit, even to myself. I never married, never had children of my own. I told myself I was content with just the land and the animals, but these past weeks have shown me what I've been missing." He turned to face Thomas directly, his expression serious in the pale moonlight. "I'm asking you to stay permanently. Not as my hired hand, not as someone I'm helping out of charity, but as my full partner. We'll work this ranch together, build it into something even better. I'll have legal papers drawn up to make you an equal owner of everything here." Thomas was quiet for so long that Jake began to wonder if he had somehow offended the man with his offer. When Thomas finally spoke, his voice was thick with barely controlled emotion. "Why?" he asked. "After everything I've done, after the shame I brought on myself and my girls, why would you want to tie your future to mine?" Jake thought about that scared, lonely 12-year-old boy he had once been, about the long years of solitude that had followed, about the instant connection he had felt with Mary and Emma, and about the deep respect he had grown to feel for their father's courage and determination, because sometimes the family you choose proves to be stronger and more lasting than the family you're born into. He said slowly, "Because those precious girls of yours deserve to grow up knowing they're wanted and loved and safe, with a future as bright as we can make it. Because you deserve a chance to rebuild your life and regain your pride. And because I've learned that a man's true wealth isn't measured in dollars or cattle, but in the people who matter to him and who he matters to in return." The next morning, Mary woke to find her father and Jake sitting at the kitchen table, official-looking papers spread between them and expressions of quiet joy on their faces. Emma was still asleep in the bed they shared, but Mary slipped out quietly and padded to the kitchen in her bare feet. "What's happening?" she asked, though something in the air, some quality of happiness and excitement, told her it was wonderful news. Thomas lifted her onto his lap, and Mary noticed immediately that her father looked different. The haunted, desperate expression that had shadowed his eyes for so many months was gone, replaced by something that looked like hope and peace and joy all mixed together. "Mary, sweetheart," Thomas said softly, his voice filled with wonder, "how would you feel about staying here forever? About this being our real home, not just a place we're visiting?" Mary looked from her father's face to Jake's, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "Forever and ever, we don't ever have to leave, never," Jake promised, his own voice thick with emotion. "If you want to stay, this is your home now. Your papa and I are going to work the ranch together as partners, and you and Emma are going to grow up here, safe and loved and with every opportunity we can give you." Mary threw her small arms around Jake's neck, her body shaking with sobs of relief and overwhelming joy. "I want to stay," she whispered against his shoulder. "I want to stay forever and ever." The years that followed transformed all 4 of them in ways none of them could have imagined during those dark days in Willow Creek. Thomas regained not only his physical strength as proper nutrition filled out his gaunt frame, but more importantly, he regained his sense of purpose, his dignity, and his hope for the future. He proved to have a natural talent for breeding and training horses, and under Jake's patient guidance, They built a reputation throughout the territory for raising some of the finest horses anyone had ever seen. Mary grew from a frightened, too serious little girl into a confident, capable young woman who could ride as well as any cowboy and had an almost magical gift for communicating with horses. She attended the school in town when weather and ranch duties permitted, but her real education came from the land and the animals and the two men who raised her with such love and care. Emma blossomed into a spirited, joyful girl who retained her mother's gentle nature while developing her father's determination and strength. She showed an early aptitude for reading and writing that impressed everyone who met her, and Jake made sure she had access to books and proper tutoring, recognizing her potential for learning and wanting to give her every opportunity to develop her considerable gifts. The ranch itself prospered beyond anything Jake had dared to dream when he had worked it alone. They expanded the house as the girls grew older, adding proper bedrooms and even a small library where Emma could study. They built additional corrals and pastures for their growing herd of horses, and their reputation for quality animals brought buyers from as far away as California and Colorado. But more than the financial success, more than the improved facilities and expanded operations, the ranch became something it had never been before, a true home filled with love and laughter and the daily joy of family life. Jake legally adopted both girls, giving them his name and ensuring their inheritance. But the bonds that tied them all together went far deeper than any legal document could capture. Thomas never forgot that terrible day in Willow Creek when desperation and despair had nearly driven him to commit an act he would never have been able to forgive himself for. But he also never forgot the cowboy who had looked past his shame and seen the man he could become again, who had offered not just charity, but true partnership and belonging. In the evenings, when the day's work was finished, and they all gathered on the porch to watch the sunset paint the desert mountains in brilliant colors, Thomas would sometimes catch Jake's eye and nod his quiet gratitude. Jake would nod back, understanding passing between them that needed no words. They had all saved each other, in different ways and at different times, and they had built something beautiful and lasting from the broken pieces of their separate sorrows. Mary, now a young woman of 20 with suitors calling regularly despite her unconventional upbringing, often thought about that day in Willow Creek that remained etched in her memory with perfect clarity. She understood now, as she hadn't been able to then, just what desperation could drive a good man to consider, and she understood the true magnitude of Jake Morrison's gift to their family. He hadn't just prevented a tragedy, he had given them all the chance to become who they were meant to be. One warm evening in late spring, as they all sat on the porch watching a mare and her new foal gambol in the near pasture, Emma looked up from the book she was reading and asked with the directness that characterized her, "Papa Jake, do you ever wish you'd had children of your own instead of us?" Jake smiled and reached over to ruffle her dark hair, now as familiar and beloved a gesture as breathing itself. "Emma, honey, I do have children of my own. I have you and Mary. And the fact that I didn't help bring you into this world doesn't make you any less mine or me any less yours." Thomas felt his throat tighten with the same emotion that still caught him by surprise after all these years, whenever he witnessed Jake's unquestioning love for his daughters. "Girls," he said softly, "you need to understand something important. What Jake did for our family that day in Willow Creek, the choice he made to help strangers when he could have just ridden on by, that's not something most people would have done. We were blessed by his goodness in ways we're still discovering. But Jake's not like most people," Mary said with the simple wisdom that had always characterized her. "He's our papa, and we're his girls, and we're a family. That's all that really matters." As the sun disappeared behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple and gold, Jake Morrison looked around at his family and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from a life well lived and choices made with love rather than fear. He had found what he hadn't even known he was searching for in the frightened faces of two little girls and the desperate eyes of their father on that hot day in a dying town. The desert wind carried the familiar sounds of home horses moving peacefully in the pasture, the gentle murmur of the creek, the soft voices of the people he loved most in the world. This was wealth beyond any measure he had ever imagined, a fortune built not on gold or cattle or land, but on love freely given and gratefully received, on second chances and chosen family, and the courage to open one's heart to strangers who become everything that matters. The story of that desperate day when a hungry father had tried to sell his daughters for $10 would be told and retold in their family for generations to come, not as a source of shame, but as the miraculous beginning of their greatest blessing. It was the day that desperation met compassion, that brokenness found healing, that four lonely people discovered that the strongest families are sometimes those bound not by blood but by choice, by love, and by the everyday miracle of hearts that recognize home when they find it. Under the vast Arizona sky blazing with stars, Jake Morrison held his daughters close and knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he belonged, surrounded by the family he had chosen and who had chosen him in return. The lonely cowboy was lonely no more, and the broken family was whole again, bound together by something stronger than hardship, deeper than desperation, and more enduring than time itself.